In part 2 of Chapter 18, we will begin looking at invertebrate diversity. The groups that we'll look at in this first part are the sponges, cnidarians, flatworms, roundworms, and mollusks. We're grouping these under the informal classification of simple invertebrates. First, let's take a look at sponges. For each of these groups, we'll also look at the phylogenetic tree so we can see where that group is placed relative to the other animal groups. So here we have sponges. Sponges are one of the very first early groups. They have a very simple body. It's a porous body. They do not have true tissues. So remember, we talked about whether they have the presence of tissues or not. The Eumetazoa all have true tissues. The sponges do not. That means that because they don't have true tissues, they won't have nerves or muscles. However, in the sponges, individual cells can sense and react to stimuli. They typically will lack body symmetry. There might be some that have a little bit of symmetry, but the normal condition is for them to not have symmetry, so they are asymmetric. They are usually marine, although there are some freshwater species of sponges. The adults are typically sessile. That means they are anchored in place, as opposed to being motile, which would mean that they would be able to move around. Here we'll take a look at a video on sponges.
Sponges are some of the world's oldest and simplest animals. They are multicellular organisms, but do not have body parts, tissues, or organs. Their asymmetrical bodies consist of one or more tubes with an opening at the top. An asymmetrical body does not have any lines of symmetry. Most sponges live in the ocean, but some live in freshwater environments. Sponges are filter feeders. They pump seawater through the holes in their body called pores. As water moves through the pores, bacteria and tiny particles are taken up from the water as food. Sponges do not move about and rely on a continual flow of water through their bodies to obtain food, oxygen, and remove wastes. Sponges usually reproduce sexually, but some reproduce asexually by budding. Budding is the process in which a new organism develops from an outgrowth on the body of a parent organism. Once developed, the offspring detaches as a new organism that is genetically identical to its parent. Hey, want to know something really interesting about sponges? They're hermaphrodites. This means they can function as both sexes, male and female, simultaneously. During sexual reproduction, male sperm cells are released into the water. The sperm cells enter other sponges and fertilize female egg cells. The egg cells develop into free-swimming larvae and are released into the water. The larvae eventually find a place to settle and attach themselves to the sea floor, and the life cycle of these strange and simple animals continues.
The typical sponge body consists of 2 layers of cells that are separated by a gelatinous region. So here we can see these layers of cells, and there's this gelatinous area in between. So we have a layer of cells here, we have another layer of cells, and then this gelatinous area. We have pores through which the water will flow in. So water will flow in through these pores and then up and out through this central cavity here. These layers are not considered true tissues because they don't really coordinate with one another. They don't function as a unit, which is what we require to call something a true tissue. These inner cells that we see here, that would be lining the inside, are schwannocytes. Schwannocytes are flagellated collar cells. We see the little flagella here. These create currents that pull water through, and then suspended in the water are particles that then get trapped and eaten by the sponge. It traps those particles in mucus and then engulfs them using phagocytosis. So they are called suspension feeders because they are pulling materials that are suspended in the water as it passes through. In the middle layer here, we see cells called amoebocytes. So this is an amoebocyte that is in contact with this choanocyte. So you have two different cell types here. These amoebocytes will produce the structure of the sponge. Sometimes it's a flexible protein called spongin. And then in some types of sponges, you'll also have mineralized particles that are called spicules. We can see some of these spicules here. Some sponges, like soft sponges that we use, let's say for body sponges, do not have the spicules. They only have the spongin. Most types will have both spongin and these spicules in them that create that body of the sponge. Now let's take a look at cnidarians. Cnidarians will have true tissues. So the only ones that do not have tissues were the sponges. Everybody else on this group are eumetazoans having true tissues. The first group of eumetazoans that come off here are these cnidarians. These also have two tissue layers. So recall before when we looked at tissue layers, we said you could have no tissues, two tissue layers, or three tissue layers. The cnidarians have two tissue layers. That means that they have an endodermis, and then they also have an ectoderm. So we have endoderm and ectoderm. What's missing when you only have two tissue layers is the mesoderm. Now they will have this structure in here called the mesoglia. The mesoglia is not technically mesoderm because it doesn't have the same tissue organization that a true mesoderm would. So it's a middle gelatinous-like area, but it's not a true tissue. So they have that outer epidermis, and then they have the inner area, endodermis, that is lining the GI tract. And then they have this inner jelly-like area that has some scattered cells in it, which are amoeboid cells. They have radial symmetry, so if we come back up here and look, we see that off the eumetazoa right here, we have radial symmetry. So the sponges did not have symmetry. We have radial symmetry in the cnidarians, and then everything else is going to have bilateral symmetry. They also have tentacles with stinging cells, and they have what is called a gastrovascular cavity. This gastrovascular cavity has a single opening. So we have one opening that serves both the mouth and the anus instead of a complete digestive tract, which would have a one-way flow of materials from mouth to anus. Material goes in and out the same opening. It's also considered a gastrovascular cavity because in addition to digestion, it also performs circulation. It moves materials through the organism, bathes the other cells with nutrients, and removes waste. Here we'll see a video on the cnidaria.
Cnidarians are animals that live in aquatic environments. Most cnidarians can be found in the ocean, but some also live in freshwater. Jellyfish are cnidarians with soft jelly-like bodies. They spend the early stages of their life cycle attached to the seafloor and are free swimming as adults. Jellyfish have tentacles that are used to catch prey. Corals and anemones are cnidarians that spend their lives attached to the ocean floor or other underwater surfaces. Some corals get the energy they need from algae living within their tissue. The algae makes food by photosynthesis and transfers the food they make to their host corals. In exchange for this generous supply of food, the corals provide the algae with a safe place to live. Sea anemones and some corals have a series of tentacles that are used to catch and consume small organisms floating by their anchored bodies. Most cnidarians reproduce sexually, whereby sex cells are released and fertilized in water. Some cnidarians are also able to reproduce asexually by budding. Cnidarians have radial symmetry. This means their bodies are arranged around a central point with more than one line of symmetry. A unique characteristic of cnidarians are stinging cells called cnidocytes. Cnidocytes contain a toxin and are used to stun and capture prey. They are also used for defense against predators. Some cnidarians, like the box jellyfish, produce toxins that are harmful to people.
Cnidarians can have two body forms. They have the polyp and the medusa. Polyps are typically stationary, so this would be bound to a substrate somewhere. And the medusa is typically free swimming. When you see a jellyfish, you're seeing it as a medusa form. Some cnidarians will have both stages as part of their life cycle. Some will exist only as polyps, others will exist only as the medusa. Tentacles will capture small animals and protists and push those towards the mouth of the animal. If we look at a close-up of the tentacles, we see this right here. We see a cell here that is a cnidocyte. And if we focus in on that cnidocyte, we can see that it has like a little trigger on it, and it has a little coiled thread there. So when a prey comes by, it hits that trigger and it causes this coiled thread to shoot out, and it can trap the prey that way. That coiled thread might have a barb on the end of it, it might have a sticky substance, or it might even have a poison on the end of it. Those cnidocytes are referred to as stinging cells. A coral is a polyp form of a cnidarian, so it would be the stationary form. And then one of the differences we typically see with corals is they will secrete a hard external skeleton. Here we will see a video of coral.
Coral reefs. Their bright, vivid colors can be seen in tropical ocean waters around the globe. Beyond their brilliant appearance lies a hidden significance. Coral are animals. Though they may look like colorful plants, coral are in fact made up of tiny animals called polyps. These invertebrates can range from the size of a pinhead to a bit larger than a basketball. Each polyp consists of a soft sac-like body topped by a mouth covered in stinging tentacles. To protect their soft bodies and add support, the polyps secrete limestone skeletons or calicles. Corals are megabuilders. Polyp calicles connect to one another, creating a colony that acts as a single organism. As colonies grow over hundreds and thousands of years, they join with other colonies and become reefs that can grow to hundreds of miles long. The largest coral reef is Australia's Great Barrier Reef, which began growing about 20,000 years ago. Coral reefs are some of the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. Though they cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, coral reefs are home to 25% of all marine creatures. It's been estimated that up to 2 million species inhabit coral reefs, rivaling the biodiversity of the rainforest. The reefs provide rich habitat that helps protect young fish as they grow. Coral are translucent. Coral reefs get their rainbow of colors from algae or zooxanthellae that live in their tissue. Though corals use their tentacles to capture some food, most of their food comes from the algae they house. When coral becomes stressed by pollution or other factors, they evict their algae. Coral bleaching results, revealing corals' white skeletons. Coral provide a window to the past. As coral grow, their limestone skeletons form layers, similar to tree rings, that vary in composition and thickness based on ocean conditions at the time. With some coral reefs growing for thousands or even millions of years, scientists can study these layers to reveal what the Earth's climate may have been like in the ancient past. Unfortunately, climate change is putting corals' future in danger, along with the millions of species that inhabit the reefs and the 500 million people that rely on reef fish for food. Warming waters result in prolonged coral bleaching that kill coral reefs or leave them vulnerable to other threats. Without significant action on climate change, our oceans could lose many of their colorful reefs by the end of the century.
Here we will see a video of jellyfish.
Jellyfish can be found all over the world, from deep oceans to shallow coastal areas. They've been around for hundreds of millions of years. Boneless, brainless, and bloodless, jellyfish are some of the most diverse and fascinating creatures in the sea. Jellyfish aren't actually fish. With thousands of different species in 2 different biological phyla, jellyfish is more of a broad term than anything else. Unlike fish, which have backbones, jellyfish are invertebrates. Jellyfish got their common name from the jelly-like material they're made out of, called mesoglea. In recent years, scientists have started using the umbrella term sea jellies to clear up the confusion. There is an immortal jellyfish. Jellyfish can reproduce sexually by releasing sperm and eggs into the water, and reproduce asexually by splitting into 2 or cloning. But at least one jellyfish can actually reverse the aging process. The Turritopsis dohrnii has earned the moniker the immortal jellyfish for being able to undergo a process called transdifferentiation. An adult or juvenile under stress, instead of dying, can revert back to a polyp and begin the life cycle all over again. It is the only animal in the world that is known to be able to reverse its life cycle. Box jellyfish are the most venomous marine animals in the world. Jellyfish stings are a common fear of beachgoers worldwide, and with good reason. There are an estimated 150 million jellyfish stings reported annually. And while not all jellyfish have stingers, the Australian box jellyfish, or Chironex fleckeri, is considered the most venomous marine animal in the world. Its deadly tentacles can grow up to 10 feet long. Humans and other animals that are unlucky enough to get stung may experience paralysis, cardiac arrest, and even death within just a few minutes. Jellyfish are 95% water. To put this in perspective, the average adult human male is about 60% water. But jellyfish are much simpler than humans. They don't have hearts, blood, brains, or bones. Jellyfish do have very basic sensory organs in their bells and tentacles, and a simple digestive cavity which serves as a stomach, intestine, and esophagus. If a jellyfish washes up on the beach, it will mostly evaporate due to the high water content. Groups of jellyfish are called blooms, swarms, or smacks. Jellyfish blooms can form quickly, and scientists think that the jellies congregate for mating purposes. In extreme cases, the bloom can be so dense there are more jellyfish than water in a given area. They can be as small as a cubic meter or cover hundreds of square miles. While these blooms are natural, they've caused problems all over the world, such as clogging fishing equipment in Mexico, destroying Chinese ships, and closing beaches in Australia and Europe. There is still so much to learn about these floating, mysterious creatures. Scientists believe that there may be as many as 300,000 species of jellyfish that we haven't yet discovered.
Here we will see some videos of Hydra undergoing budding, which is a form of asexual reproduction.
This is a hydra, a microscopically small animal that lives in freshwater ponds and damp places. The hydra is a simple animal with a tubular body and tentacles that it uses to catch small prey. A hydra does not need a mate to reproduce. It can reproduce by itself. When a single animal reproduces by itself, it is called asexual reproduction. Asexual means without sex. The hydra reproduces by growing a young hydra from its side. The new hydra will separate from its parent, and continue to live on its own. It will be an almost exact copy of its parent.
Everything that lives must one day die, right? Well, maybe not everything. Consider the Hydra. It's named after a many-headed monster from Greek mythology. Chop off one head and two grow in its place. That myth isn't too far from the real Hydra's death-defying abilities. They're cousins to jellyfish. See the resemblance? But Hydra live in freshwater. Its body is a hollow column with walls only 2 cells thick. Its head is just a bunch of tentacles surrounding a mouth, no eyes or brain. The whole thing is about as long as a grain of rice. The hungry Hydra stretches out its tentacles to snag swimming prey. Microscopic harpoons hook the water flea, injecting it with paralyzing neurotoxins. Then, it's down the hatch. The Hydra uses those nutrients to make more Hydra. Check out this bud. It's a clone sprouting right from the Hydra's side. Hydra can reproduce sexually too, but most often, they just clone themselves. Chip off the old block. Hydra are constantly regenerating their own bodies too, replacing all of their cells every 20 days. They can do that because roughly half of the cells in their bodies are stem cells, which can develop into all the different types of specialized cells you need to build or rebuild a body. Stem cells only make up a tiny percentage of our bodies, and our stem cells degrade over time. That's why we age. But a Hydra can make near-perfect copies of its stem cells, basically forever. It's called non-senescence, biological immortality. Having all those stem cells allows Hydra to recover from all kinds of damage. All right, here we go. No body? Not to worry. No head? No problem. As long as the chopped off chunk has some stem cells, it's ready to regrow. In a couple days, the severed head has a new body. And the foot, it's got a brand new head. Soon, they'll both be as good as new, except for maybe some lingering trust issues. To test the limits of their ability to recover, researchers came up with an experiment. This Hydra is genetically engineered so that under ultraviolet light, its exterior cells glow purple and interior ones glow green. Scientists basically blend up a bunch of these Hydra, leaving a heap of mixed up cells. Right away, the cells start reorganizing. Those purple outer layer cells migrate out. The cells from the inside squirm back into the center. The Hydra dumps cells from the interior to restore its hollow shape. The stem cells start dividing and differentiating to rebuild the rest of the animal. Soon a head starts to form. Sometimes a few little heads compete to be the new top. After a few tumultuous days, what was once a mixed-up pile of cells takes on a familiar shape. Researchers hope to harness Hydra's ability to regenerate, to someday slow human aging, or even regrow damaged organs. Maybe this tiny monster will one day show us the way to the mythical fountain of youth.
Here we'll see a video of a Hydra eating a Daphnia. Here we'll see a video of some thimble jellies.
That cloud you see is, in fact, a colossal swarm of thimble jellyfish, each no bigger than your thumbnail. These jellyfish are 95% water. They are, in a sense, separate from and a part of the sea at the same time. They've survived for 650 million years. And yet, they have no brain, no heart, no blood, no gills, and no complex nervous system. Somehow, they can taste, smell, and balance themselves. A fairly complex task. Not every jelly is so tiny. Luminous moon jellies, from some angles, look like huge cathedrals of light in the sea. From another angle, they look like the swaying hoop skirts of dancing mushrooms in an animated movie. 10,000 of them hang out together at a time, and just like the thimble jellies, there isn't one brain among them.
Here we'll see a video of some sea anemones and clownfish.
There are over 1,000 species of sea anemone in the ocean. But don't be fooled. They are nothing like the innocent flowers they're named after. Sea anemones are meat-eating killer fish traps. With the slightest touch, it injects a venomous neurotoxin into its prey, strong enough to paralyze a small fish. The tentacles drag the helpless fish into its central mouth, where it's digested whole. They may be clownfish, but they're no clowns. Sheltering in the arms of a predator takes a special kind of preparation. Scientists believe that clownfish brush themselves carefully against the tentacles until a layer of anemone mucus covers the fish. This fools the anemone into accepting it. Clownfish aren't the only ones to befriend this killer. Smaller sea anemones are a hot commodity in the field of underwater security. As part of the hermit crab's bizarre survival plan, it gathers up sea anemones to use as bodyguards. Hermit crabs don't have armor of their own, so they hide out in shells discarded by other animals. And this one's got a sea anemone pre-installed. But one isn't always enough. Sea anemones like staying put. They grip onto hard surfaces with a large disc-like foot. The hermit crab knows just the trick. A slight tickle here, an easy lift. His moves are so smooth that the anemone doesn't even close up during the procedure. An octopus has spotted his prey. He pounces on the crab, but gets a mouthful of anemone. He tries again. The meal is striking back. It's not worth his trouble. And the hermit crab's mobile fortress is a stinging success.
Our next group are the flatworms. The flatworms belong to the phylum Platyhelminthes. Platy means flat, and helminth refers to worms. We can see the Platyhelminthes here on this phylogenetic tree. We are in the first group of organisms that have bilateral symmetry, and if we follow this branch, we are up here at the top. They are the simplest of the bilaterally symmetric animals. all animals with the bilateral symmetry also have 3 tissue layers. They are triploblastic. Remember, sponges have no tissues. Cnidarians are diploblastic. They have 2 tissue layers. Everything else here has 3 tissue layers. Everything else is both bilateral symmetry and triploblastic. When we look at the bilateral organisms, it splits into the deuterostomes, we'll see a little bit later, and then the group up here we split into 2. We have the Lophotrochozoans and the Ecdysozoans. These Platyhelminthes are part of the Lophotrochozoans. They have no body cavity. Remember before we talked about the coelom and we said there's 3 conditions: acoelomate without a coelom, pseudocoelomate with a false coelom, and coelomate, which is a true coelom. The flatworms have no body cavity, so they are acoelomate. If we look at the body plan of a Platyhelminthes, this is a free-living form, we can see that it does have a head end that comes along typically with bilateral symmetry. We see at the head end of the organism we have a concentration of sensory organs, and we also have a centralization a little bit of the nervous system. We do have a nervous system, and we also have this GI tract that we see here. This is a little bit similar to what we saw in Cnidarians, where we call this the gastrovascular cavity because it has a single opening and it also is serving both digestive and vascular functions. So the distribution of nutrients and removal of waste, we don't have a true cardiovascular type of a system with blood vessels. It's this gastrovascular system that is doing that. You see you have a primitive brain-like structure here with these ganglia at the front, and then you have these 2 nerve cords that run down the side of the animal. So it has a very simple nervous system, but it does have a nervous system. Now, Cnidarians actually do have what we call a nerve net, but there's no centralization to that nerve net that we see because of that radial symmetry. Now that we have bilateral symmetry, we have a little bit of cephalization and centralization of that nervous tissue. Flatworms can be either marine, freshwater, or in moist terrestrial environments. Some of them are free-living, like the planaria that we see here, and others are parasitic. Liver flukes and tapeworms are parasitic flatworms. This is a picture of a tapeworm. It has hooks on it that allows it to attach to the GI tract of its host, where it then absorbs nutrients from the host. So it doesn't actually have a mouth because it's just absorbing across its body those nutrients. Here are some videos for the Platyhelminthes.
Once inside human intestines, a tapeworm can grow to be 60 feet long. They have other adaptations that are equally amazing, but not very pretty. They have no eyes or mouths. Their heads have transformed into ghastly hooks and suckers that latch into the intestinal wall. With a secure hold inside the gut, they can proceed with their main task, making more tapeworms. The worm's body is a conveyor belt, cranking out tiny breeding machines. Each one produces sperm and eggs, generating huge batches of offspring. In fact, the number of eggs generated by even one tapeworm exceeds the total number of human beings alive on Earth. Few of the worm's embryos will survive in the outside world, but those that do have plenty of places where they can go.
Our next group are the roundworm. The roundworms belong in the phylum Nematoda, also called nematodes. They also have bilateral symmetry, as will everything else that we'll talk about here. One of the new characteristics that we see in the nematodes that we did not see in the flatworms is that they have a body cavity. They have 3 tissue layers. Nematodes belong to this group down here, the ecdysozoans. Now we have a complete digestive tract. So instead of a gastrovascular cavity with one opening, we have a complete digestive tract where food moves one way from the mouth all the way through and is expelled through the anus. That allows for a lot more efficient mechanism of breaking down the food and absorbing it. When you have this one-way flow, now different parts of the GI tract can specialize for doing various things. The anterior part of the GI tract is typically functioning to break down the food, and then the posterior portion is primarily for absorbing nutrients and water. We also see they have a cuticle that is produced. This cuticle is a non-living protective coating. They have to shed it, and that's why these belong to this group Ecdysozoa. The Ecdysozoa, the nematodes and arthropods, have outer covering on the body that has to be shed periodically for them to grow. For the nematodes, this prevents them from drying out. It helps protect them. Many of these will be parasites, and this outer coating can help them overcome the host defense mechanisms. Some nematodes are free living. They live in soil and they function in decomposition. And then others are plant and animal parasites. Some examples of parasitic ones, we have dog heartworm, trichinella, which is something you can get from improperly cooked pork, and hookworms. Here's a picture of parasitic nematodes in the artery of a porpoise. And here are some videos of nematodes.
C. elegans is a microscopic roundworm, also known as a nematode, that is 1 millimeter long. These nematodes are usually found in temperate soil environments worldwide. In the wild, they feed on the bacteria that help to decay decomposing plant matter. In the laboratory, however, C. elegans are typically fed lab strains of E. coli. C. elegans are transparent, thus facilitating the study of the cellular differentiation and developmental fate of each of its cells. There are 2 forms, hermaphrodites and males. Hermaphrodites have 959 somatic cells, while males have 1,031. The organism's neural circuit, made up of only 302 neurons, is extremely primitive, especially when compared to the approximately 100 billion neurons and the 60 trillion connections between them, known as synapses, that make up the average human brain. However, as a result of its simplicity, transparent nature, and the well-characterized cell lineages, the entire pattern of neuron connections, or connectome, of the C. elegans has been mapped. Despite the relatively simple neuronal system present within C. elegans, it displays numerous complex and primitive behaviors. Primitive behaviors include feeding, locomotion, and reproduction. Complex behaviors include learning, mating, or social behaviors. Researchers study behavior of these worms by observing how they are attracted to food and chemicals. Ultimately, behaviors reflect the activity of the nervous system. Despite their small size and simplicity, C. elegans are very useful to science, both to understand basic biological mechanisms and also to study basic mechanisms of disease that translate to understanding how to fight disease in humans.
If you're a dog owner, chances are you've heard of heartworm disease. And if you aren't familiar with it, well, brace yourself for some serious nightmare fuel. It's basically exactly what it sounds like. An infestation of worms, collectively known as Dirofilaria, in a dog's heart. These parasitic nematodes are transmitted by mosquitoes, and different species are found all over the world. The most common in North America is Dirofilaria ematis. The adult parasites live and reproduce in the dog's pulmonary arteries, eventually clogging the chambers in the right side of the heart. This leads to all kinds of nasty complications like fatigue, coughing up blood, and ultimately, heart failure. And usually, if your dog has enough worms to show symptoms, getting rid of them is really hard. That's why vets encourage pet owners to use preventative medications that decrease their risk of infection and lessen the spread of disease. And it turns out that lowering the risk of transmission is good for dogs and people, because humans can be infected with heartworm too. Now, before you freak out too much, heartworm infections in people don't cause symptoms nearly as bad as they do in dogs. And they're super rare. Fewer than 120 cases have been reported in the United States since 1941. The main difference is that our immune systems aren't as easily tricked by the worms. You see, when a mosquito bites an animal with a heartworm infection, they suck up microfilariae, the earliest larval stage of the worm. Those mature through their next larval stages inside the mosquito and then migrate to its proboscis, the stabby part it uses to suck up blood, and arguably its least endearing feature. When that mosquito goes for another blood meal, be it from a dog or human, the larvae bust out and get onto the skin. Then they, no joke, crawl around until they find a way in, like the tiny hole made by the mosquito. From there, they have to wiggle their way through the skin tissue to get into small blood vessels so they can travel around the bloodstream, eventually making their way to the pulmonary arteries and the lungs. Inside the body, they grow and mature for about 6 months until finally, the mature worms reproduce and release their little microfilariae back into the bloodstream, starting the whole process over again. Now, where dogs and humans differ is that usually the larvae never make it into the bloodstream. This is probably because the larvae transmitted by the mosquito are in their third stage of development, or the L3 stage. And studies of human infections with related species of nematodes have shown that our immune system is really good at recognizing and mounting a response against parasites when they're at this stage. In fact, this is probably why human heartworm infections are considered rare to begin with. It's not that we're rarely infected, it's just that we rarely stay infected long enough for anyone to notice. So sometimes a rogue larva does find its way into a person's lungs. But even when this happens, the worm never gets a chance to grow and reproduce the way it would in dogs. The immune system always spots it and sends cells to destroy it. This destruction process forms nodules in the lung tissue, which is usually how we end up figuring out that someone had heartworm infection. These nodules, called coin lesions, are rarely harmful. They're mostly just annoying because other deadlier conditions also cause them, so doctors have to take them seriously. As for why our immune systems always end up finding and killing those worms, well, it probably has as much to do with bacteria as it does with the parasite itself. Filarial nematodes like Dirofilaria have an intimate partnership with bacteria called Wolbachia. The bacteria live inside the worm's cells, and it's a mutually beneficial relationship. The worms provide the bacteria with amino acids for growth, while the Wolbachia are essential for the development of the worm's larvae. And the bacteria also play an important role in the parasite's ability to infect a host animal. Proteins produced by Wolbachia cause the host's immune system to start fighting a bacterial infection, a type of immune response called a Th1 response, even though there isn't a bacterial infection going on. Now here's why this is important. Th1 responses are counterbalanced by immune responses called Th2 responses. They basically do opposite things. Th1 responses promote inflammation, while Th2 responses dampen it. So the presence of Wolbachia can shift the immune system toward more of a Th1 response, but the Th2 responses are what our immune systems use to attack worms. So by inducing the Th1 response, the bacteria seem to essentially distract the immune system, allowing the worms to sneak around and proliferate. Some scientists even think a strong Th1 response helps the larval worms grow and mature. Also, dogs really get the short end of the stick here, because studies have shown that Th1 response is increased when the host host has more microfilariae in their system. So once a few worms have set up shop and started breeding, the dog's immune system gets even worse at fighting them off. So humans can totally be infected with heartworm, but the reason the disease hits dogs way harder has to do with how our different immune systems react to the worms and their bacterial allies. And that's why it's really important to talk to your vet about heartworm meds for your pets. Your furry friends will breathe a little easier, and so, presumably, will you. Heartworms are pretty nasty, so it's great that our bodies have figured out how to kill them. But you might not want your body to get rid of every worm that wiggles its way in. In fact, having worms may be a good thing for your immune system. And we have a whole episode that explains why, which you can watch next.
Our next group is the mollusks. They belong to the phylum Mollusca. We can see the mollusk group here on our phylogenetic tree, up here with the flatworms and the annelids in the Lophotrochozoa group. We know that they have 3 tissue layers and that they have bilateral symmetry. Mollusks are a diverse group, but they share a common body plan. The features they have in common with one another is they have a muscular foot that functions in locomotion. On this diagram, we see the foot here. They also have what is called a visceral mass that contains most of the internal organs. All of this area in here is the visceral mass. It has the heart, digestive system, the excretory system, the reproductive system, all in that visceral mass. They also have a mantle. The mantle is showing here in this purplish color. It's on the inner surface lining that shell, and it actually will secrete the shell. So it encloses the visceral mass and then secretes the shell. Many mollusks will also have a radula, which is a rasping structure. We can see it here, and then we can see it blown up in this picture. They will use this radula to scrape algae and other food particles off of surfaces. They have bilateral symmetry. They are part of that Lophotrochozoa group, which is the top 3 phyla here. They have a trochophore larva. The trochophore larva looks something like this. All of the mollusks have this particular type of larval stage. They have complex organs and organ systems. We see a cardiovascular system, we see a nervous system, a reproductive system. They have a cardiovascular system, but it's also what we call an open circulatory system. We can see the heart here, and we can see blood vessels that come off of that. The difference between this circulatory system, which is open, and ours, which is closed, is that in this organism where it's open, the blood does not stay enclosed in vessels throughout the entire tract. It will actually go into like an open cavity area. Our blood stays within blood vessels, whereas here it's pumped into like an open cavity. Now let's take a look at some of the classes of mollusks. We have the gastropods, which are the snails and slugs. Gastro means belly, so this essentially translates into belly foot. Most of these are protected by a single spiral shell, or some of them will be without a shell. The aquatic species will use gills for respiration, but the terrestrial species will respire across the mantle. Then we have the bivalves down here. Bivalves have a shell that is like a hinge, so there's 2 halves separated by a hinge, and then they also will use gills for respiration, and then their gills are also typically used for suspension feeding, meaning they filter out particles that are suspended in water. We have over here the cephalopods. Cephalo means head, so this literally translates into head foot. These are typically fast, agile predators. We see the nautilus here, which is similar to more of the ancient form. If you were to cut into a nautilus, you would see that the inside of that shell has chambers. And then some of the other cephalopods, like the octopi and squid, may have very reduced internal shells. They may have little to no shell. Cephalopods are very complex organisms. They have complex behavior, complex sensory system, and actually quite large brains. Here are several videos on mollusks that will be posted separately on the course website. That ends our section on the simple invertebrates.